There's a lot of these hype train videos about, I switched to this, I switched to that. Well, I didn't switch to anything. This is a real full review. You can see it's dark now. I started in the light. The recording of this video was like over 2 hours, so I had to edit a lot. But I'm gonna summarize my conclusions at the beginning so you don't have to watch it all unless you really wanna see the nitty gritty and the why and the how. I use both of these apps all the time. I'm very good with both of them because I'm always creating recipes and formulas and presets and styles for my videos and for my site. And this is what I think of Lightroom versus Capture One in 2023. Who has the best raw processing? Who has the least worms, the best noise reduction, highlight, shadow control? However, I usually preface this review by giving you the conclusion first. The bottom line is that Lightroom is going to offer you a better value for the money. Lightroom, with its AI tools, has brought a lot of value to Lightroom in the past year or so, and is miles ahead now in terms of what you can practically do with layers than Capture One, even though Capture One's layer tools technically have more controls. The problem is Capture One is, if nothing else, phenomenal at ignoring customer feedback. Also with Capture One is the price, and let's look at that. Even if you pay a year in advance, you're going to be paying about $15 per month for Capture One alone. If you pay monthly, they jag you even more at $24, or you can buy the perpetual license for $299. But since Phase One recently changed their terms and conditions, even for people that already bought it, whereas most softwares, you buy a perpetual license, you get a year of updates, and then after that, the software keeps working, you just don't keep getting the updates. They even threw that in the trash, throwing the perpetual license users under the bus. Let's contrast that to Adobe. You can actually still get Lightroom, I think, with a terabyte of storage for $10 a month, or you can get the better deal, because skip that, get Lightroom plus Photoshop. Sometimes you got to dig a little bit. It's not the first option that's shown, but as of now, this is still available. $10 a month for Lightroom and Photoshop. So Capture One, you're gonna pay 50% more and you're only getting the raw processor. It's important to understand that. Capture One compares to Lightroom. They go head to head. They're great processing apps. They have good quality. Lightroom has more modules, like the print module. It has more features. In general, I would say Lightroom's gonna be easier to use, easier to find resources and plugins, and the interface and the controls are generally simple, although in Capture One, you can change things around more. It's edit keyboard shortcuts, whereas that's not actually a feature in Lightroom, which is completely stupid that you can't edit your keyboard shortcuts in Lightroom 15 years later. There are some workarounds and there's things you can do if it's really important to edit shortcuts. There's a lot of plugins and things you can add to Lightroom that you're not gonna see in Capture One. But Capture One does have more inherent options and panels and turning panels on and off and taking a panel from here and moving it over to my second screen. I use Capture One in Lightroom extensively, and I use them in their most advanced nuances because I'm creating presets and tools and workshops. I'm making things like the Filmus Film Pack, and that requires a ton of nuance and refinement. Capture One does have more controls. Does that mean it's better? Not really. For most of you, it's gonna mean it's actually probably a little more complicated to get really advanced results. If you look at the results of something like my classic neg-like presets or my Ektar or my Portra, you can see that in both Lightroom and in Capture One, the results come out phenomenal. We can get that filmic look. We can get great control over tone and highlights and shadows. It's all there in both apps. If you get Capture One, don't think because it has a little bit more options in its layers that you can escape getting a good pixel editor like Photoshop, like Affinity, something like that. If you want to do advanced edits, you're still going to want a layer-based pixel editor. Capture One and Lightroom are raw editors first, not layer editors, even though they both have layer features. Lightroom came in and they made the amazing AI layer masks even better by letting us select eyeballs and hair and skin separately and just doing these amazing things that can then be compacted into presets like I do with my elegant speed mask presets. And you can just do these incredibly advanced things with just a click and save yourself a ton of time. Capture One has nothing like that. Both of these are gonna edit your photos great. If you're comfortable in one over the other, you're gonna do just fine. You're gonna pay a bit more of a premium to use Capture One, get a little bit less features overall, not have the AI tools, but it's still gonna give you great results and great nuance. And some people just love the way Capture One renders. And if you're one of those people, that's fine. In the end, these are all just tools to help us be better creatives and produce better output. If you're looking for the best bang for the buck, the value, what gives you more for the money, Lightroom, hands down, has the win in 2023. This video hasn't been easy. I feel like I have to up the ante each year, be a little more detailed. And honestly, Capture One has not been the most exciting. I think this is one of the great things about Capture One is that it is more customizable. The interface to me feels a little more primitive. I think it's going to be a little harder and slower to learn if you're new. If you're comfortable with it, you probably think it's amazing. But when you look at the icons and the details and like just the way you're always having to move for everything in Capture One. So you have the library, you have color, adjust. You can customize any of these and make it the way you want. You can expand and add a panel. You can put a panel over here on a secondary screen, and that's actually really cool. Yes, you can do dual screen in Lightroom, but it's fairly limited because Lightroom doesn't actually give you the ability to do any extensive customization of. I'll tell you when I'm in Lightroom and when I'm Capture One, just in case you can't see the icon up in the corner or it's not clear. But I actually, for this video, made my background a little bit lighter in Lightroom than I did in Capture One, where I made the interface a little bit darker. Even though Lightroom's interface is a little bit less customizable, I do find it's generally more intuitive. What I would say about Lightroom is it's more ergonomic. You have the library, which is the grid and the larger view that you do with the space bar. Then you have develop. And these are the two areas you'll live mostly, but Lightroom actually has other modules like map and book and print and web and slideshow and all these different things that Capture One does not have. Now you might be saying, well, I don't need those things, and that's fine. Although I do find myself using things like the print module very often because it's so easy to make simple print layouts that fits your page size and things like that. Things like the book module can be very useful for doing basic layouts and not having to use something like InDesign or some other page building program. If I take this portrait here in Lightroom and I go in, I can manually adjust it or I can go to a preset. So I'm going to do something like go to Portra 400 from the Filmist collection. I might play with my exposure a little bit here on the right. I have basically my presets here on the left and then all of my controls on the right. Okay, so it's good. Let's go to the same image in Capture One now. You can see that the image is a bit darker. Part of that is probably just the default profile that's been applied, but sometimes a raw file, whether it's from Sony or Canon or Nikon or any of them, they interpret differently. So sometimes you do have color differences and nuance differences. I can actually go to Filmist 1.8 here in Capture One as well. I'm gonna apply that same Portra 400, and now I'm just gonna go up to adjust and turn up the exposure a little bit. And so here is my Capture One edit, and here is my Lightroom edit. Here's the thing though, both of these look good, and you may look and say, oh, I think one looks better than the other. So I'm gonna take this photo and I'm gonna run a complicated formula. I'm gonna do something like my new Ektar 100 Gen 2 from Filmist. This is a complicated color formula. I'm gonna run it, I'm gonna turn it up a little bit, and here's my original, and here is my Ektar look. Okay, let's go over to Capture One. Now I'm gonna go to the style, and I'm gonna do this for purposes of demonstrating to you guys how these nuances can matter and how many of them there actually are in each of these apps. Here's the Ektar 100 Gen 2, feels a little dark, so I'm also gonna push the exposure up a little bit. I tend to find myself pushing exposure up a little more in Capture One. And you can see if I go back to Lightroom, I have this, and if I go to Capture One, I have this. And let's start zooming in now. They're actually very close to one another. This is a 1-to-1 zoom here in Lightroom. Let's do the equivalent zoom in Capture One. This is a Fuji file. A lot of times people say, oh, Fuji files are better in Capture One. It's really not the case anymore. You can see there's slight differences, but this Ektar film put into this gave us almost an identical result. But let me show you a little bit about what's going on behind the scenes, and then we're going to talk about noise and worms and things like that a little. If I come into my color adjustments in Capture One for this photo, and I go down, one thing Capture One has is this advanced color editor. You can see in here that I've done an immense amount of color adjustments to try and get this Ektar look not only consistent with the original intent of the classic Ektar film and make an Ektar-like recipe, but just refine it so that it works across all kinds of different photo types, so it has the same feel. And I can click anywhere and say, hey, I just want to affect this color, and now I can control all these little nuances of it. And I can go down here and then I could saturate it differently and do all kinds of crazy things with it. And it's pretty cool what you can do with that. If you go down to Lightroom, you can see I've achieved the same look, and they look super, super close to one another. And if you use my other presets, particularly my other film presets, if you use like Classic Neg or Classic Chrome or my Portrait, you see that we get a very similar look between these. And even though I don't have that same ability to do advanced color and select an exact color channel in Lightroom, which I would love to have, by the way, I still have hue, saturation, and luminance that are very nicely nuanced, even with an advanced complicated formula where I'm trying to emulate a film or something like that. I can still get virtually an identical result from the highlights to the colors to the shadows to the grain in Lightroom and in Capture One. That's actually good. It means that whatever one you choose, you're going to be getting great results. The Capture One, yes, you get some of these more nuanced controls. You even have little extras, like whereas in Lightroom, you just have curves, and you can do an immense amount of nuance with those curves, but you also have levels. Does it mean Capture One will replace Photoshop or a similar layer editor? Absolutely not. That's not what it does. It's a raw editor. I'm always starting with some kind of a recipe, some kind of a formula, a preset. Both Lightroom and Capture One are very preset and style driven. So to get the most out of them, you want to be using those. They both come with their kind of default presets, which honestly are not very good. But whether you're making your own or downloading or buying packs like mine, you want to be using them. And there's things you get when you use presets. So for example, let's take this photo here and let's actually go to my free Film Sampler pack. You can download this on my site and I'll put a link to it. Let's say I applied something like the classic Neg Light G2, okay? Now I could go to this next style and I could right click and say, no, apply this to a layer. And it's gonna say, well, it can't use everything from this preset, in this case film grain, but it can still apply the look. So I'm gonna apply partially, which is basically the whole effect. Now, if we go back to one of our panels that has the layer panel, you can see here that we've combined these, which is a bit too much. But the cool thing here is that you can then adjust the layers. So in Capture One, you can put the preset on a layer and then adjust it along with your other settings so you can combine looks and get really cool. Let's swing over to Lightroom. Capture One used to have an edge in this. And even though Lightroom now does it a little bit differently, it's still really great. So if I go to here, let's say I apply a single file HDR preset from Natural HDR. Now you see what happens is it applies the effect, but I have a slider up here and I can dynamically turn it up or down. But it's not actually just like a layer. Watch the curves over here. Instead of just adjusting opacity, it's actually dynamically adjusting all the settings that were within that preset, which makes it really amazing because I can turn it up, I can turn it down. So each kind of have their advantages, but both give you a ton of control. Here, let's go to the Silver 5 free sampler. Again, another one you can download from my site. And if I apply a black and white preset to this portrait, again, you see I have this slider up here and I can go up or down respectively in that effect. Not turning it off like a layer and letting color shine through, but actually dynamically changing the amount of sliders being applied. And this works with anything. This even works with a preset that only applies a curve, like I showed you in my recent F-curve videos. I want to address the noise in detail a little bit in Capture One because this comes up a lot. Here we are in Capture One, and overall the image looks really, really close. But let's drill in a little bit. People talk about that worminess that sometimes comes out in files, particular Fuji files, but there's a lot of mythological kind of stuff around this because it's not what most people think. In fact, let me show you. Let's go to Refine in Capture One, and we're going to see the noise settings. And you can see the noise reduction by default is at 50 on this Fuji file. Let's go back to Lightroom, and you can see how we are here. If we go down to our sharpening and noise reduction settings, you can see that noise reduction is at 0. A lot of times what happens is people look at these and they say, oh, it looks better in Capture One, but a lot of times what's happening is Capture One is just applying more noise reduction. If you look at the Lightroom version here versus the Capture One version here, the Capture One version does actually feel a little bit softer, and that's because it's applying more noise reduction. You might look at the Lightroom version and say, oh, I see what they mean. Let's zoom into 200 and you'll see even more. You start maybe seeing, oh, there's that worminess, right? This is an ISO 200 file. It's pretty low ISO, but guess what? If I turn the sharpening up, and Lightroom's sharpening algorithm will go too far very, very fast. So don't push it too hard. Capture One, and you start turning up the sharpening, and it has a completely different numerical value. You can see that, oh, it's sharpening, but I'm not seeing all the worminess. But guess what? If you turn off the noise reduction, now that worminess starts coming through. Here we are kind of dialing in the Lightroom. I'm putting about 32 of noise reduction, a little color noise reduction. I'm going to leave the sharpening at default. And you can see now there's really not much of this worminess, this kind of mythological worminess that they talk about in Fuji files, but actually can happen on any file if you zoom in close. If we switch to Capture One with the noise reduction off, you definitely see more of that. Equal noise reduction more or less on all of them, and look at the details on the lettering as well as the wall. I know we're pixel peeping here, but this is what people like, right? Lightroom's actually a little bit sharper even with its default sharpening settings, and neither one of them are worming. Now, if you get high ISO files, and I've done a video specifically on this whole worminess thing, I did that last year, and frankly, it hasn't changed that much. If you compare apples to apples at low ISO or high ISO on pretty much any file, you're going to find more or less the same thing. If I go over here to Lightroom with this Sony file, and I go down here and I start playing with sharpness and noise reduction, I can start getting these weird little artifacts in a full frame Sony file that really have very little difference from the worminess. Is a Fuji file a little more susceptible to getting what we call worminess because of the way it censors, the way it interprets raw files, things like that? I think it is. It's also a crop sensor. It's a little more susceptible to noise. Is Capture One better at getting a great result, at getting rid of that, at preventing worminess, at doing the noise reduction and while maintaining sharpness? No. It's actually not. I know this is going to be heresy, but I might go so far as to say that noise reduction, maybe not sharpening, but noise reduction in Lightroom might even be better. And I'm going to look at this. Let's look at how these manage shadow and highlights, because those are super important aspects. Okay, I'm back in Lightroom with this image of the big community Christmas tree in San Juan del Rio, and it's super dark. What you can't actually see is this Christmas tree is like 150 feet tall, and there's houses at the bottom, and there's people like all surrounding this. In fact, I'm gonna do a one-stop exposure increase on this, but then I'm gonna go over to shadows and just play with it. Normally, of course, I would go to a preset like Natural HDR or something like that, but I wanna focus on the highlight and shadow testing alone here without a lot of other developed settings like I would normally do. Okay, so I'm at 86 on shadow and minus 48 on highlights, and you can see we've introduced quite a bit of noise and artifacting, but we do have quite a bit of information. This is not how I would finish this image, like I said, but I want to compare how each of these handle that. Capture One. Now we're going to go straight to the dynamic range section. I'm going to turn up one stop of exposure like I did in Lightroom, which is pushing the highlights a little bit, but I think it's going to help me recover these shadows. So I'm going to lift those shadows. This time I got to push all the way to 100 because, well, Lightroom, I'm not to 100, but it's pushing more shadows, okay? And then I'm going to pull highlights down a bit to about 47 as well here. Okay, so you can see here, I'm gonna turn my shadows, I'm in Lightroom again, I'm gonna turn the shadows down a little bit more because Lightroom shadow slider is pushing a bit harder. When I look at these, I feel like I'm getting a little more definition here in the Lightroom version, but that may be personal preference. But I do wanna draw your attention to one thing. Let's look up here at the sky where the shadows and the highlights are kind of meeting, and then let's do the same in Capture One. Despite all the talk about wordiness that we're always doing between Lightroom and Capture One, this is the Capture One, and it's actually got a ton of artifacts here. So let's go in and try and turn up the noise reduction a little bit, and I start losing detail really fast if I turn up the noise reduction. I do start improving it, but I have these weird pixely white spot kind of highlights here. Now we're in Lightroom again. Let's switch back and let's go down to the noise settings. We've still put no noise reduction on this. This is still the default. So now I'm going to turn up the color noise reduction and start turning on the luminance noise reduction here. And again, I'm just going to go to like 30 or 40. And you can see as I turn this up, it really starts cleaning up that sky. If I go to 100, the sky is really clean. And of course, there's some detail lost here. But if I go to 100 on Capture One, I'm starting to get still artifacts. It's not actually getting rid of everything. Maybe I'm just lifting my shadows a little bit too much. Looking at this comparison, a high ISO shadow recovery, Lightroom is doing a better job at recovering a lot of shadows in a dark, difficult scene and managing noise reduction. Let's take a quick look at highlights. Let's take this image strongly backlit by the sun, and we're gonna do a little shadow recovery. I'm here in Capture One, bring up the shadows just a little bit, and then really pull these highlights back and see what we can do. Okay, I'm gonna pull back to about 88 here, swinging over to Lightroom. Okay, same image. Let's go again, do a little shadow lift. They're both looking very similar, and bring it down to about 88 here as well. When I look at both of these, they both look really good. In the past, Capture One would have actually won this because it had this better nuance and really intense highlight. But now they've both really caught up in the way they can handle highlights. And this is an important test. If a raw editor can't handle its shadows and its highlights well, you're gonna get artifacts and things are going to fall apart. And I've tested some other raw editors that I won't name right now since it's not a full test of those, and they really didn't hold up. Here we are in Lightroom, and you can kind of see how it's handling the backlight, the chromatic aberration, the fact that this is completely blown out. And here is our Capture One version. Both looking pretty good. The edges are a little different in Capture One, but they're still both really, really close. I can push a little harder in Lightroom, but it kind of starts pushing those highlights a little muddy, a little gray, and I don't feel like I'm gaining much. The Capture One version, you might be looking at this and saying that, there's a little more contrast or color. I think a lot of it comes down to the shadows. I've pushed shadows to 27 in here. So if I go back to Capture One and push the shadows up more, you can see how the detail and information we have is very close. It's important to note that in real life, I wouldn't edit it this way. I would go to something like Natural HDR, Miscape, and I would do a process that really brought out the color and the sunlight and the rays. And I could do that exact same process within the Styles panel of Capture One and get that same kind of look here in Capture One. Some of you might look at the Capture One highlights and say, Gavin, what are you talking about? The highlights were better in Capture One. It's very close. Okay, but let's talk about details, about masking and the things we can do between both of these. Here's a portrait scenario where we're on the beach. Let's go to something like Portra 400 Gen 2 from Filmist, okay? So now I've done my basic recipe and you can see I've modified my color and my adjustments. What I still lack is something with that background, that sky. Now I can go up here in Capture One and create a layer. And so let's compare those directly. If I create a layer, now I have to select this. I could do a luminance selection. There's no AI tool. But I could use the magic brush. And then I could go into the settings of the magic brush and play around with it. I don't want it to be too heavy of tolerance. And you can see here that, okay, I clicked here in the sky and it did an okay job of selecting this sky. It is selecting some of the water and the other light areas. A lot of times it doesn't work this well because, well, this sky is very distinctly separated. And let's do some highlight recovery and just kind of pull that sky back and bring some color and light into it. Maybe increase the contrast a little bit, pull the exposure down. So now we're kind of getting it. Here's my layer that I put the sky on, and we did okay. It's affecting more than the sky. I'm getting a little bit of artifactiness down here in the water a little bit, just because of the way it's feathering off. See that? So I'm gonna have to push it a little bit less. I don't wanna go too far with it. But can we select the skin? Let's do that. Let's make a new layer. I'm gonna go to that magic brush again because it's the closest thing we have to any sort of an AI tool. Okay, so we made a selection, not super smart, but it did select a lot of the skin. It also included the hat and some other things. But what I can do now is I can actually turn down clarity, for example. I could increase the exposure a little bit on her. So we're getting overall a pretty decent look. Now, I'm just gonna do a little more general highlight recovery on the main background layer, maybe punch the whites a little bit, pull the blacks down. And you can see that from here to here, with just a preset and a few manual adjustments, we got a nice filmic looking scene. I'm pretty happy with that. In fact, in the past, that was the best you could expect from a RAW editor, and probably that would have been better than what we could have get in Lightroom just a couple of years ago, which is why you hear people talk about Capture One's layer power. Being able to stack those layers up, it's still not the same as using Photoshop and the nuance you can get there, but you can get 90% of it. Okay, let's come to Lightroom. We've got the same image. I've already ran a basic develop preset, so you can see we have some settings and she's looking pretty good. And let's actually come here and just do some masking. So I could go right up here and manually add these masks, all right? So let's just run like the Portrait AI Beauty combo here from these Elegance presets. And all these are doing is it's telling Lightroom, hey, build the masks and then apply these settings to them to save me time. She's a little too bright, but you can see here in Lightroom, it made the selections flawlessly. Here's the subject, here's behind the subject, and we could actually get way more specific than that. Now, I could come over here and build a bunch of masks. I can do subject, sky, background. I can select people, and it's gonna give me options of, hey, what features of the person do you want to select? And of course, I can roll that into a preset like the People Filmic preset right here. And this is similar to like what we have in Elegance. There's just more in Elegance. And guess what? Now it's separating. It's actually making a mask for all of these. So I can say, well, my subject overall is a little too bright. Let's darken that a little bit, but everything else is actually coming out amazing. These masks are already all named and built and ready to go because they were built into a preset. But of course you can do all these manually. In fact, let's do one more manually. Let's take and create a new mask and do a select sky mask, not just a select background, because I want to independently select the sky. You can see it's not totally perfect. It missed a little bit here, although it's feathering off pretty nicely. And I can dial back my sky just a little bit more with highlights, bring up the saturation and color. Here's our final version in Lightroom, and here is our final version in Capture One. I think I'm gonna push my saturation just a little bit in Capture One. Here's our overall edit in Capture One, and here's our overall edit in Lightroom for this particular image. They don't look that far apart. Here's our Lightroom, here's our Capture One. If we reset in Capture One, we went from here to here. And if we reset in Lightroom, we went from here to here. You might even look at my Lightroom version and what I did with the masks and say, I think you're over processing in Lightroom. And that could be because I'm trying to demonstrate to you guys that the AI masks, you really can be very specific in your selections, and then you can do things as mild or wild as you want. In Capture One, you're not probably going to want to do that because the magic brush isn't that precise. The other tools aren't that precise. You can make manual masks, but if you're gonna paint manual masks and go to that level of detail, go to your pixel editor like Photoshop, like Affinity, because it's gonna give you more control. The ability to take these AI masks that we can do in Lightroom, where I can say, hey, separate my background, I build those as a preset, I apply it, I tweak it a little bit for that group of images, then I can paste that to 20, 30 different images. And yes, it uses system resources. Yes, it does have to do a lot of chugging away on processing, but it's doing very advanced edits and it's automated and all. I can't do that. I can't simply take everything in Capture One. You still can't properly save layers into your styles and presets like you can save layers in Lightroom, saving massive amounts of time because you're super limited of what you can actually put in the layer. I actually did a video on that. So that feature was basically lipstick on a pig. Change capture time? That's a feature? That's like the New Year's feature. I'm sorry, guys. Like the big feature in Capture One was smart adjustments for 23. They hyped up smart adjustments almost like it was some sort of AI tool when in reality, it's a very rudimentary tool. And essentially you have this new panel and you can take a reference that takes white balance and exposure. It's not the same as just copying and pasting settings. You can take your white balance and exposure setting, right, and use it. I can say, hey, here's my reference image, and then I can go to this image next to it, all right, and I can apply, and it's gonna try and make my overall white balance and exposure to be the same. And the problem with that is because it's just kind of doing the overall lightness and the white balance. There's no kind of AI power. It brings in all the other settings and tries to actually do a match, right? Where you're getting the same process, the same effect. There are other things that we could talk about here. Whereas Lightroom, you're getting everything. You're getting Lightroom Classic, which is what we focused on here, but you can also use Lightroom CC desktop or online version. You can take a collection in Lightroom and I can say, hey, sync this collection with Lightroom, that is the cloud Lightroom, and it's gonna sync it up here. I can have only the things I want sync into the cloud, but still be using the extra power of Lightroom Classic. Pretty much everything is the same. So if I go to Lightroom Cloud, all my developed settings are the same. I still have all my masks, all my edits. Those are now syncing if they're on the cloud. I can access those from my phone and I can come into Lightroom Mobile and still have all those settings visible. Edit, play with it, it syncs back. It now shows up on my Lightroom Classic. You might find, like I did, that, hey, wow, actually being able to have all my favorite photos on my phone and edit them there and experiment with presets and make new things and still have all those features is great. Capture One does have an iPad app now, so your SOL if you have other things, right? But it's very limited. It's not the full suite of tools like you have. It doesn't even have, if you look for upcoming iPad features, as things like ultimately synchronization, like eventually we hope to synchronize, and Lightroom's been doing it for years now, and you can do it across your mobile and your desktop and all this stuff. To top it off, if you want the privilege of using the limited iPad app, you're gonna pay another $5 a month. That is Lightroom versus Capture One. I know there's more we could cover, and this video could go on for hours. You let me guys know, you guys let me know in the comments, okay, if there's features you think are better in Capture One or better in Lightroom. I know some people say Capture One is way better for tethering. Nothing compares to Capture One in terms of tethering. It's what all serious pros use. And I'm like, wait a minute, I've been doing this for like 20 years and I'm a pretty serious pro, and I have been, and I've known some of the most serious pros in the business. If you need to and Capture One is better, try that feature. See if it works better for you. I'm not hating on anyone that uses Lightroom or that uses Capture One. These are both quality processing apps and they're both gonna give you good results. For the money, hands down, Lightroom is a better value. Heck, you can get Lightroom plus Photoshop plus all the mobile Lightroom stuff that works on Android and on iOS and on cloud and on desktop and everywhere for $10 a month with Photoshop as of the recording of this video. You're gonna spend twice that much just to get Capture One with the limited mobile app. I won't know when I see your photos on the wall where they were edited because that doesn't matter. So if you're more comfortable in Capture One, if you like it, but if you're thinking, hey, I'm thinking about moving away, yeah, Lightroom's not hard to switch to. They're not that different in the way they process and edit photos, and you're gonna transition pretty quickly. This year, more than previous years, there's really no contest. Lightroom has advantages over Capture One in so many ways that I don't want to sound like I'm just biased, I'm anti-Capture One, because I've always been an outspoken critic of Adobe's cloud system as well. I think life was better when we just bought it every 18 months and it was ours. You guys let me know what you think in the comments. I hope you found this review useful. Please tell me what you thought so I can keep it in mind for when I do next year's review. And hopefully Capture One will up the game, start listening, and be a little less arrogant and a little more humble about making their product accessible and a value offering for the photography industry. Thanks, guys, and we'll see you next time.